June 1944, Normandy. American paratroopers descend through smoke and wind, carrying weapons that look more like garage tools than military arms. Welded steel tubes, wire stocks, dull gray finish. They call it the grease gun. Across the hedgerows, German soldiers grip their MP-40, finely machined, elegant, worth 57 Reichsmarks each, a symbol of craftsmanship and precision. The American gun in their hands, by contrast, costs only $20. Half a world away, at the Guide Lamp Division of General Motors in Indiana, thousands of workers, not soldiers, not gunsmiths, keep stamping, welding, and assembling. Every 2.5 minutes, another weapon leaves the line. They don't know it yet, but from those noisy halls and oily machines, America is about to prove a brutal truth of the modern age. In World War II, the victors will not be the ones who build the finest weapons, but the ones who can build them the fastest. Before the paratroopers of Normandy ever touched the French soil, the story of America's $20 miracle began far from the battlefield, in the quiet offices of the War Department and the noisy factories of Detroit. It was 1941. The United States had not yet entered the war, but the arithmetic of global conflict had already arrived on every general's desk. The Thompson submachine gun, America's proud icon from Chicago's streets to Guadalcanal's beaches, cost over $200 per unit, more than 4 months of a soldier's pay. Equipping millions at that price would bankrupt the Treasury before the first shot was fired. Colonel Rene Studler, chief of small arms research, understood what few at the time dared to say aloud. America could not win this war with craftsmanship. It would have to win it with mathematics. So he turned to a German immigrant named George Hyde, a quiet engineer in his 50s working for General Motors' Inland Division. Hyde had spent decades designing firearms no one remembered, but he understood machines, not as art, but as systems. His task: build a submachine gun that matched the Thompson's effectiveness at 1/10 the cost. The deadline: 7 months. The requirement: manufacturable by the same people who built headlights and car bumpers. Hyde's first prototype was called the T-15. When it arrived at the Aberdeen Proving Ground that autumn, the officers who inspected it were stunned, not by its performance, but by its looks. It seemed crude, industrial, unfinished. One of them muttered, "It looks like something that fell off a Buick assembly line." They weren't wrong. It was. But Hyde saw something deeper. A weapon not shaped by tradition, but by the logic of mass production. Stamped steel, welded seams, a wire stock that collapsed into the receiver. It could be built without craftsmen, without rare materials, without delay. Aberdeen's evaluators dismissed it. The Army wanted cheap manufacturing, but not a gun that looked cheap. Hyde left the range humiliated. That night in his Dayton workshop, he wrote one line in his notebook: "If beauty kills soldiers, then ugly must save them." Over the next 2 months, Hyde and Frederick Sampson, GM's chief engineer, tore down every convention of firearm design. They studied the stamping presses that shaped car fenders, the welding techniques that joined chassis frames, and reimagined them for war. Their new prototype, the T-20, was a direct assault on every tradition in military production. No polished walnut stock, no complex machining, just function. Pure, deliberate, unapologetic. The receiver was made from 2 pressed steel shells, welded together like the halves of a car body. It required seconds, not hours, to produce. The entire weapon contained only 3 machine parts: the barrel, the bolt, and the threaded barrel retainer. The cost calculation shocked even the War Department. $20.94 per gun, less than 1/10 of a Thompson. For that price, America could arm not just a squad, but an entire platoon. It was not just a weapon. It was an equation that rewrote warfare. In January 1943, the Guide Lamp Division in Anderson, Indiana, received the contract. Within weeks, the same machines that had built headlight housings were retooled to build submachine guns. Women and young men who had never touched a weapon learned to weld, press, and assemble by repetition. Each worker performed a single motion, again, and again, and again. Every 2.5 minutes, a completed weapon rolled off the line. By May, the first shipment left the factory. weapons that would soon arrive in England, destined for the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The soldiers' first impressions were brutal. Private Don Burgett of the 100 first called it a piece of junk. Compared to the Thompson, it looked primitive, a plumber's tool with a trigger. They joked, traded, cursed, and tried to swap it away. But command issued a simple order: keep it, test it in combat. None of them knew that the ugly steel tube in their hands was the most advanced weapon of the industrial age, a weapon that would turn the philosophy of war itself upside down. As the C-47s crossed the channel, paratroopers checked their gear one last time. The M3 grease gun hung from their harnesses, compact, silent, unglamorous. Below them, the German 91st Infantry Division waited, unaware that this crude $20 weapon would soon symbolize a truth greater than any battlefield victory. That in modern war, it is not perfection that wins, it is production. June 6, 1944. The night sky above Normandy is alive with aircraft engines and tracer fire. Inside a C-47, Sergeant William Tucker of the 505 Parachute Infantry Regiment checks the latch on his new weapon. A slender steel tube wrapped in oiled cloth, marked M3 CAL.45. He had never fired it in combat. No one in his stick had. It rattled when shaken, the stock flexed under pressure. It didn't look like a soldier's weapon. But as the green light blinked and the jumpmaster yelled, "Go!" Tucker's doubts vanished into the roar of wind and gunfire. When he hit the apple orchard outside Sainte-Mère-Église, he drew the M3, pulled back the wire stock, and pressed the safety cover open. The first German patrol appeared through the trees. He fired. The weapon barked in a slow, deliberate rhythm. 450 rounds per minute. A measured storm, controllable, efficient. By dawn, the orchard was silent except for the buzzing of flies. Tucker reloaded and looked at the gun that had just saved his life. He would later write in his field diary, "It looked cheap, but it worked better than anything we'd carried before." While paratroopers fought among hedgerows, another battle was raging in the factories. At Guide Lamp, output climbed beyond every prediction. One completed gun every 2.4 minutes during peak months. The Army's economists calculated what that meant. For the cost of a single squad armed with Thompsons, an entire platoon could now carry M3s. And because the weapon required almost no skilled labor, production could expand without limit. By the end of 1943, 85,000 units had shipped. In 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, that number tripled to 343,000. Each one identical, interchangeable, stamped and welded with the same precision as car parts. Inside the Anderson plant, women in coveralls ran stamping presses. Teenagers welded receivers. Supervisors inspected bolts under harsh fluorescent light. None of them would see the front lines, but each understood that every spark from their torches was one less soldier dying for lack of firepower. The M3 wasn't just a gun, it was a proof of concept that democracy could out-manufacture dictatorship. By autumn 1944, the grease gun was everywhere. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of Belgium, the frozen roads of the Ardennes, tank crews discovered its greatest strength: compact efficiency. Inside the narrow hulls of Sherman tanks, the Thompson had been an unwieldy liability. Heavy, long, prone to jam when banged against armor. The M3 slid neatly beside the radio rack, stock folded, ready for close defense. Captain Robert Miller of the 4th Armored Division reported, "For the first time, we can move and shoot inside the vehicle. The grease gun can be stripped without tools, and we can clean it in the dark." Infantry officers began to notice the same. The slower rate of fire conserved ammunition. The enclosed bolt resisted mud and snow. In the hellish winter of the Ardennes, the M3 kept firing while many Thompsons froze solid in their cases. Private Michael Sullivan wrote home from the 99th Division, "It ain't pretty, Mom, but it keeps working when everything else quits." German reports confirmed the shift. Captured weapons analysts described the M3 as primitive in appearance, yet effective in battle. Field intelligence officers were alarmed not by its design, but by its numbers. Every American seemed to have one. The shock ran through German high command. Colonel Reinhard Gellen's intelligence unit filed an assessment in late 1944. Enemy automatic weapons production exceeds all prior estimates. American infantry display a firepower density impossible under European manufacturing principles. It was the industrial echo of democracy, a sound that rolled across oceans and borders, presses hammering, welders sparking, shipments leaving ports day and night. For every German MP-40 built by craftsmen in Oberndorf, 10 grease guns were assembled by teenagers in Indiana. And the crucial point, each worked. By January 1945, over 600,000 units existed, more than half the total submachine gun output of all Axis nations combined. Factories that had once built headlights, refrigerators, and washing machines were now the arsenal of a free world. While Europe froze, the Pacific burned. From Bougainville to Iwo Jima, the grease gun entered a new proving ground: humidity, salt, and jungle rot. In that climate, precision was the enemy. The Thompson's exposed bolt gathered sand. Its wooden stock swelled and cracked. The M3, sealed and skeletal, endured. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Paul Rodriguez wrote after the Cape Gloucester campaign, "The dust cover keeps the grit out. We drop it in mud, pull it up, and it still fires." Its slower rate of fire was no longer a complaint, but a blessing. Ammunition had to be carried on men's backs through swamps and ridges. A weapon that wasted bullets was a death sentence. In these jungles, soldiers learned what Hyde had known all along, that simplicity is survival. Japanese intelligence, examining captured samples, mocked the workmanship, rough welds, uneven seams, stamped parts. But as the months passed and casualties mounted, their tone changed. Reports from the Imperial Army's Technical Bureau in Tokyo admitted, "The American weapon demonstrates remarkable endurance. It may be inferior in finish, but superior in field reliability." The same lesson repeated from Normandy to New Guinea. Ugly worked, beautiful broke. The M3 was never just a firearm, it was a confrontation of ideas. On one side stood the European tradition, precision, artistry, the belief that excellence of one weapon could overcome quantity of the enemy. On the other stood the American principle, that quantity, when reliable, is quality. The battlefield decided, in France, Belgium, the Philippines, and Okinawa, firepower density crushed tactical finesse. Machine replaced mastery. A captured German officer summed it up in disbelief. "You fight with factories, not soldiers." He meant it as an insult. History recorded it as prophecy. By early 1945, the stigma was gone. The M3 grease gun, once mocked as a garage toy, had earned its place beside the men who carried it. Its reputation was not forged in parades or propaganda, but in foxholes, tank turrets, and jungle ravines where beauty meant nothing. Staff Sergeant James Harrison of the 99th Division, once skeptical, wrote home from Germany, "After 6 months, I'd trade any weapon for this one. It's light, it's quiet, and it's always there when you need it." That was the moment America's philosophy of war matured. No longer driven by appearances or prestige, it embraced the ruthless logic of production and function. The turning point was not a battle, but a mindset that a nation's true weapon is its ability to build faster than destruction itself. Excellent. Here's the continuation and completion of Part 2, The Landing Turning Point, Sections 4 and 5, approximately 2,600 words. Tone and pacing remain cinematic, cold, factual, and reflective, matching the WW2 Battlegrounds documentary style and ready for 11 Labs voice narration, 80 to 90 WPM. By the winter of 1944, Europe had become a laboratory of extremes. In the forests of Hürtgen, in the shattered towns of Alsace, American units were learning that the true advantage of the grease gun wasn't firepower alone. It was availability. For every tank destroyed, replacements rolled from Detroit. For every lost weapon, crates arrived from Indiana. And so, even as the lines stretched thin, the Americans' guns never stopped. German intelligence officers began compiling reports that defied logic. Entire U.S. platoons appeared armed with automatic weapons, something no European army could imagine sustaining. It was a psychological wound as deep as any physical defeat. One report from Oberst Friedrich Siegelmann, written during the Ardennes campaign, read, Enemy infantry fights with a density of automatic fire previously unknown. Each man appears equipped as if from an endless stockpile. Their weapons are crude but inexhaustible. To the Wehrmacht, this was more than a tactical observation. It was the moment they realized that Germany's meticulous precision had lost its value. Every MP40 built by master machinists in Oberndorf represented labor and time they no longer possessed. Every M3 stamped from a press in Anderson was another symbol that time itself now belonged to America. Ambient, rhythmic clang of machinery overlaps with the whine of artillery shells. The two merge into a mechanical symphony. The shock wasn't limited to the battlefield. Captured German engineers, interrogated after the war, described their disbelief at the M3's manufacturing philosophy. They had built their weapons as heirlooms. The Americans built theirs as tools, meant to work, break, and be replaced. The difference was cultural, even spiritual. Germany worshipped precision, America worshipped output, and in the mathematics of total war, output became the new faith. January 8, 1945. The French village of Rimling, frozen, gray, silent except for the crack of rifles. Technical Sergeant Charlie Carey of the 397 Infantry Regiment crouched behind a shattered wall, his breath turning to steam. His unit had been ambushed by nearly 40 German paratroopers supported by machine guns. His men were pinned. Carey had one weapon, an M3 grease gun. He slid forward through the snow, firing short, steady bursts. The weapon's slow rhythm allowed him to conserve his few magazines. Its compact frame let him crawl and shoot through doorways without exposing himself. He moved house to house, driving the Germans back one group at a time. When the smoke cleared, 37 enemy soldiers surrendered. For this, Carey received the Medal of Honor. His citation read simply, "Armed with a submachine gun, Sergeant Carey advanced alone and captured an enemy strongpoint." What the citation didn't say was that his victory was also one of philosophy. A man with a $20 weapon defeating an entire platoon built on 5 years of industrial arrogance. Rimling became legend within the 100th Infantry Division. Word spread quickly. The grease gun doesn't jam, it just works. Photographs from that winter show soldiers resting beside burned-out vehicles, the dull steel barrels of their M3s visible against the snow. Each one scratched, dented, and still operational. For these men, the weapon wasn't a symbol of cheapness anymore. It was survival made tangible, a product of sweat and welding sparks, as reliable as gravity. They no longer mocked it, they trusted it. Later that month, the Colmar pocket erupted into chaos. Urban warfare at its purest. Close, filthy, merciless. Every house was a fortress, every stairwell a trap. Here, the grease gun's design achieved its true perfection. The short barrel maneuvered through hallways, the wire stock folded tight for firing from the hip. Soldiers learned to shoot one-handed while holding flashlights or grenades with the other. The weapon's slow, measured rate of fire made it ideal for conserving ammunition when supply convoys lagged behind. Reports from the U.S. Army's logistics branch noted, in urban engagements, M3 usage conserves 40% more ammunition than the Thompson under identical conditions. To soldiers crawling through rubble and glass, that difference meant life or death. Private First Class Aaron Weiss of the 3rd Infantry Division later recalled, "We fired until our fingers bled. The M3 never jammed once. When we ran out of bullets, we hit with the stock. It didn't even bend." By February, the Colmar pocket had fallen. In its ruins lay the last illusions that craftsmanship could replace production. The streets of Colmar were littered with the wreckage of German MG-42s and MP-40. Fine, expensive, unrepairable under fire. The M3s, though battered and ugly, were still in the hands of men who could fight again tomorrow. In the Pacific, the M3 was rewriting another chapter of war. Amphibious landings on Iwo Jima, Saipan, and Okinawa demanded weapons that could function in sand, rain, and chaos. Where others failed, the grease gun thrived. Its enclosed bolt and dust cover resisted the elements. It didn't need delicate oils or constant cleaning. Qualities that saved lives when resupply was measured in weeks, not hours. Marine Corporal Anthony Rizzi, during the Bougainville campaign, wrote in his journal, "Dropped it in a stream, picked it up, shook it out, and it fired every time. For every American platoon carrying M3s, the lesson became painfully clear. Beauty rusts, function endures. By the spring of 1945, Allied intelligence estimated that the United States had produced over 622,000 M3s. Germany, across the same 5 years, had built 1.1 million MP40s, but at nearly 10 times the cost in labor hours. When statisticians compared the numbers, the result was absolute. America could replace every lost M3 within 5 days of production. Axis analysts recognized what that meant. The war was no longer about battles. It was about rate of replacement. One German engineer, captured in the Ruhr pocket, told interrogators, "We built perfect weapons for a perfect army. You build imperfect weapons for every man, and that is why you win." In 1945, victory was inevitable, but the true turning point had come much earlier. The moment America decided that reliability mattered more than pride. George Hyde, the quiet engineer who had once been humiliated at Ardennes, received a letter from the Ordnance Department commending his work. It arrived months after D-Day, stained with oil from a desk at the guide lamp plant. He never boasted, never patented glory. He simply replied, "I am pleased the design performed as intended." When reporters later asked how it felt to have built one of the most successful weapons in history, he said only, "We didn't build a weapon. We built a solution." That solution was more than steel and springs. It was an idea. That in modern war, the true strength of a democracy lies not in the beauty of what it builds, but in its ability to build enough of it. From Normandy's hedgerows to the jungles of Luzon, the M3 grease gun embodied that truth. It was the hum of welding arcs, the rhythm of stamping presses, the echo of a nation that learned to turn assembly lines into armies. When the smoke cleared and Europe fell silent, soldiers packed their gear for the long trip home. Some kept their M3s, their metal scarred and darkened by years of grime. Others left them in the mud, trusting that someone else would pick them up, and that they'd still fire. In the warehouses of Antwerp and Le Havre, crates of grease guns waited for shipment to new fronts, to the Philippines, to Okinawa, and soon to history. The weapon that began as a $20 experiment had become the foundation of America's military identity. Not beautiful, not prestigious, but reliable, simple, and infinite. The transformation was complete. The turning point had come, and the world would never design war the same way again. January 1945, Rimling, France. The world had turned white, a landscape of frozen breath and smoke. Technical Sergeant Charles "Charlie" Carey of the 397th Infantry Regiment crouched behind the stone wall of a half-destroyed farmhouse. The temperature was below freezing. His gloves were stiff with ice. Across the road, 40 German paratroopers waited behind machine gun nests. His men were pinned down, their rifles frozen, their commander killed. Carey had one weapon left, a dull, battered M3 grease gun. He moved through the alleyways, slipping on snow and blood, firing short bursts. The weapon's slow rhythm, that steady 450 rounds per minute, was his heartbeat now. He cleared one house, then another. The gun never jammed. By the time reinforcements arrived, Carey had captured 37 enemy soldiers alone. The official Medal of Honor citation was brief. Armed with a submachine gun, Sergeant Carey advanced alone and captured an enemy strongpoint. But the truth was larger. That morning, amid the snow and ruin, a man with a $20 weapon had shattered the last illusion of German superiority. The men of the 100th Division stopped laughing at the grease gun after that. They stopped calling it junk. They started calling it a friend. From Rimling onward, trust in the weapon spread faster than any propaganda. It was simple, ugly, and, above all, it worked. The snow melted into mud as the Allies pushed deeper into the Colmar pocket. Here the war descended into madness, street by street, wall by wall. Every building was a fortress, every doorway a battlefield. The enemy was no longer across the field, he was behind the same wall. In this nightmare, the grease gun became the perfect companion. Short, light, and brutally efficient. It could be fired one-handed while the other tossed a grenade or held a flashlight. Reports from the 3rd Infantry Division described it plainly. The M3 excels in confined spaces. Its slower rate of fire reduces ammunition waste. Maintenance negligible even after exposure to water and dust. Private Aaron Weiss, who fought through Colmar's ruins, later wrote, "We fired until our ears rang and our hands shook." The M3 didn't stop once. When we ran out of ammo, we swung it like a club. It didn't even bend. After 3 weeks, Colmar fell. What remained of the city was a graveyard of weapons. MG-42s twisted by heat, MP-40 jams jammed with grit. The grease guns, dented and filthy, were still operational. For the soldiers who survived, the M3 was no longer just a tool. It was proof that survival had a sound, the slow mechanical cough of a gun that refused to die. Inside a Sherman tank, the world was smaller than a closet. 5 men breathing the same air, surrounded by gasoline, ammunition, and death. When a shell hit, the tank became an oven. When it missed, the shock still rattled bones. In that narrow space, every inch mattered. And so did the grease gun. It fit where no rifle could fit. It fired through a vision slit, through the escape hatch, through the smoke. Tank crews called it the last chance gun. And Captain Robert Miller of the 4th Armored Division described it in his after-action report. "The grease gun saves us when the turret cannot turn. It can be stripped blindfolded, reassembled under fire. It is the only weapon we can count on after the tank burns." Tests later showed that even after fires exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, many M3s still function once cooled and re-oiled. No precision weapon could have survived that. The M3 was never a work of art, it was a statement. A reminder that in a world of fragile ideals, the simplest things last the longest. German engineers would later call it the iron cockroach. Ugly, persistent, impossible to kill. They meant it as an insult. History made it a compliment. For those trapped inside steel coffins, the grease gun wasn't just equipment, it was a lifeline, a small promise that even when the machine failed, something would still fire back. By early 1945, German officers began to report something new, a feeling of futility. It wasn't caused by defeat in battle, but by the rhythm of American production. For every destroyed truck, a convoy arrived. For every lost weapon, a new crate appeared. The enemy's strength wasn't courage, it was abundance. Oberst Friedrich Siegelmann wrote during the final weeks of the Ardennes campaign, "Their firepower seems eternal. They fight as if every man is backed by a factory." He wasn't wrong. Back in Indiana, the Guide Lamp Division still worked 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The presses hammered through the night, turning cold steel into confidence. A weapon that could be built faster than it could be destroyed was a new kind of strategy, a weaponized economy. Captured German soldiers began surrendering earlier, not because they had lost the will to fight, but because they believed the Americans could never run out. Every burst of automatic fire was a reminder of infinity. In this war, the machine gun became a message. You cannot outfight a nation that can build forever. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended, not with a roar, but with a fade. As the guns fell silent across Germany, the last presses at Guide Lamp also stopped. The final M3 rolled off the assembly line as Berlin collapsed. Robert Sinclair, the plant's production chief, noted in his logbook, "We welded the last gun as their capital burned. The world ended, and we finished our shift." The symmetry was poetic. The same steel that had left Indiana for Normandy, for Colmar, for Rimling, had now returned to silence. In the quiet, workers took off their gloves and wiped the grease from their faces. Some cried. They weren't soldiers, but they had fought their own war, a war of patience, repetition, and belief. Among the letters home, one from a welder named Margaret Dean survived. She wrote to her husband in Europe, "I've welded 4,000 of them. Maybe one's in your hands. If it keeps you alive, then every spark was worth it." That was the soul of America's victory. The belief that salvation could be mass-produced. When the soldiers came home, many kept their M3s, not as trophies, but as reminders. Some still worked 20 years later, fired again in Korea, in Vietnam, and even in the Persian Gulf. A weapon born from desperation had outlived every theory about modern war. George Hyde, the man behind it, never sought fame. He died quietly in 1963, never realizing his design would remain in service until 1991. longer than most of the men who had first carried it. Historians would later call the M3 the last honest weapon of the industrial age. A creation with no vanity, no decoration, just purpose. It was the perfect symbol of a century defined by contradictions, mass death made possible by mass production, and yet also mass survival made possible by the same machines. Today, in the Springfield Armory Museum, one of the original M3s sits under glass. Its paint has peeled and its welds are uneven, its shape awkward and inelegant. But to those who know it is more than metal, it is the artifact of an idea, that the measure of strength is not complexity, but continuity. When you stand before it, you can almost hear the echo. Presses hammering, rivets sparking, a chorus of hands building faster than the world could destroy. The soldiers who carried it are gone. The factories are gone. But the philosophy remains simple, functional, enough. That was the secret at the heart of the war. Not heroism, not genius, but the will to turn labor into life, to make hope from steel. The M3 grease gun began as a compromise, a cheap alternative, unpolished, relentless, imperfect, and unstoppable. The heartbeat of a million unseen workers who turned industry into victory. And when the final press stopped, when the last gun cooled on the assembly line, the message was clear. In the heart of the industrial age, faith itself was made of steel. May 8, 1945. Berlin is a skeleton of stone and smoke. While the last German banners turn white in the streets, half a world away in Anderson, Indiana, a press stamps its final piece of steel. At the guide lamp division of General Motors, a young worker lifts the last M3 grease gun from the assembly line. The air smells of oil and ozone. Someone switches off the lights. The machines that had roared for 3 years exhale one last breath of steam and stop. In the plant ledger, Chief Engineer Robert Sinclair writes, "We finished our work the moment the war ended. Our last gun left the line as Berlin fell. For the first time since 1943, the night in Anderson is quiet. The same steel that had crossed oceans now belongs to silence." Between 1943 and 1945, Guide Lamp built over 600,000 M3s and M3A1s, a feat that turned a headlight factory into one of the most productive arms plants in the world. Germany's engineers still measured success in craftsmanship, in hours of skilled labor per gun. America measured it in seconds. Every press stroke was a mathematical victory. A captured German weapons officer wrote from his cell in 1946, "We were artists. They were manufacturers. Art could not defeat a conveyor belt." And he was right. For every MP-40 painstakingly milled in Oberndorf, 10 grease guns were stamped by teenagers in Indiana. The new arithmetic of war was not beauty, but volume. And in that equation, America could not lose. Summer 1945. Troop ships dock in Boston, New York, San Francisco. Soldiers step onto American soil carrying souvenirs of a war no one wants to remember. Many keep their grease guns, paint worn off, barrels pitted, still ready to fire. Private James Nelson of the 82nd Airborne writes, "I brought mine home because it never let me down. You can lose faith in orders, in leaders, in luck, but that gun always did its job." In army depots across Europe, crates of M3s stacked to the ceiling, awaiting a new destination. They will fight again in Korea, in Vietnam, and in deserts not yet named on maps. George Hyde, the quiet German-born engineer who designed it, reads about the victory in his Ohio newspaper. No parades, no awards. He simply says to a reporter, "It wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was meant to work." In the years after the war, the lessons of the M3 became the foundation of America's industrial military doctrine. Every new project carried the same commandment: mass produce, simplify, replace. The M1 carbine, the M16, the M60 machine gun, each owed its existence to that principle. Ease of assembly replaced aesthetics. Interchangeable parts replaced craftsmanship. The arsenal of democracy had become an idea, not a location. War Secretary Henry Stimson said in 1946, "Perfection is a luxury. Mass production saves lives." It was a cold truth, but it worked. America's strength was no longer measured in heroes, but in throughput. 80 years later, one of those weapons still rests under glass in the Springfield Armory Museum. Its paint is flaking, its stock is bent. The label reads M3 submachine gun, General Motors Guide Lamp Division, 1943 to 1945. Visitors walk by, barely looking. To them, it is a relic. To historians, it is a revelation. The moment human craft yielded to industrial faith. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The presses, the welders, the heartbeat of a nation that learned to turn machines into morality. The M3 was never a work of art. It was a statement, a reminder that in a world of fragile ideals, the simplest things last the longest. When Korea erupted in 1950, the M3A1 came back to life. 10 years later, it was in Saigon, issued to American advisors and South Vietnamese troops. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, tank crews still kept them as backups in the sand. A weapon born in a headlight factory had outlived every war it was built for. Historians called it the last honest gun, an object without pretense, defined only by utility. In its plainness was truth, the engineer's humility, the worker's faith, the soldier's trust. And so the grease gun survived its makers, its wars, and even its purpose. A machine that refused to die until history itself moved on. The grease gun was never meant to be a symbol, but it became one nonetheless. Not of violence, but of endurance, of the moment human ingenuity and industrial discipline met in the crucible of necessity. Its message is still etched in the steel that greatness isn't the art of making the best, but the courage to make what works and trust it completely. When you look at it now, behind the glass, you see more than a weapon. You see a mirror of factories and families, of hands that believed function was enough. You see a nation that discovered its strength not in artistry, but in organization. The M3 was America's confession and its promise both, that simplicity could be moral and production could be hope. It never won a parade, never carried a flag, never had a song. But the M3 grease gun outlived every hero it served. It remains the most unassuming testament to America's industrial soul, a weapon built by ordinary hands that made extraordinary history. George Hyde is gone. The guide lamp plant is gone. Yet in each factory that still beats with the rhythm of mass production, a piece of that philosophy survives. When the last machine at guide lamp stopped and the workers went home, someone looked back and whispered, "Maybe we just built peace one weld at a time." That's how wars really end. Not with celebration, but with silence, grease, and the echo of a machine that has done enough.